It was supposed to be a routine panel discussion, broadcasted live to millions across the country. The topic, ethics in government, a conversation that had brought together political heavyweights and sharp-witted commentators. But no one expected the moment that would dominate headlines for days, trend globally on social media, and leave former President Donald Trump visibly rattled. Sitting at the center of the table was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, calm, collected, and impeccably prepared. Trump, who had made a surprise appearance to set the record straight, underestimated the firestorm he was about to ignite. From the moment the cameras rolled, he attempted to dominate the conversation with his usual bravado. "Nobody's done more for this country than I have. The economy was booming, everyone had jobs, and everyone loved me, until the fake news and radical Democrats tore it all apart," he declared with his signature hand gestures and self-applause. The audience clapped politely, but Jasmine remained still, her eyes never leaving him. When the moderator asked her to respond, she smiled slightly and leaned forward. "Mr. Trump," she began with a calm, assertive tone that silenced the room, "you talk a lot about being a victim, about being persecuted. But let's not forget who you are and what you've done. You call everything fake news, but the facts are not fake, and the truth has never needed your permission to exist." Trump scoffed and attempted to interrupt, but she raised one finger calmly and continued. "You brag about jobs, but under your administration, millions lost healthcare, wages stagnated, and when the pandemic hit, your leadership failed. You said it would disappear like magic. Instead, thousands died needlessly because you refused to listen to scientists." Trump shifted uncomfortably, visibly clenching his jaw. "You want to talk about law and order?" she asked, her voice now cutting through like a razor. "You incited a mob. You sat back and watched as they stormed the Capitol. You didn't protect democracy, you tried to destroy it. And now you stand here trying to rewrite history like we weren't all watching in real time." The audience gasped, and the moderators looked at each other, unsure whether to intervene. But Crockett wasn't done. "You say you're for the people, but let's talk about the people you mocked, the disabled, the immigrants, women. You say you love black people, but you told 4 congresswomen of color to go back to where they came from. That wasn't just racist, that was dangerous." Trump tried to interject again, raising his hand and blurting, "That's a lie. I did more for the black community than any president, maybe even Lincoln." Jasmine didn't flinch. "You passed a few policies that benefited wealthy developers and called them historic. But you refused to denounce white supremacy when asked directly. You hesitated. You blinked. That silence spoke louder than any tweet you ever fired off." The crowd erupted in applause. Trump's face turned red, not from the lights, but from the pressure of someone speaking truth with unwavering clarity. His voice shook as he attempted a weak comeback. "You're just angry because you're irrelevant in real politics. You're just trying to make a name for yourself by attacking me." She leaned in one last time. "Mr. Trump, I don't need to attack you to make a name for myself. You've written your own legacy, one that history will judge harshly. I stand here today not to make a name, but to remind the people watching that truth still matters. That courage still matters. And that bullies, no matter how powerful, always fall." Silence filled the room, but only for a moment. The applause that followed was thunderous. Social media exploded within minutes. Clips of Jasmine's speech flooded Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Hashtags like #CrockettClapsBack and #TrumpHumiliated on Live TV began trending worldwide. Analysts across the spectrum, left, right, and center, were stunned by the force and composure of her words. Trump stormed off the set, his team scrambling behind him. He would later rage on his social media platform, calling the event rigged and Crockett a disgrace. But the damage was done. For the first time in a long time, he had been silenced not by volume or censorship, but by facts, by courage, and by a woman who refused to be intimidated. Backstage, Jasmine Crockett stood quietly with her team, sipping water, unaffected by the storm she had just caused. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply did what she came to do, speak the truth, live on national television, and remind the country that integrity still has a voice. Mr. Trump, I don't need to attack you to make a name for myself. You've written your own legacy, one that history will judge harshly. I stand here today not to make a name but to remind the people watching that truth still matters, that courage still matters, and that bullies, no matter how powerful, always fall. And that single sentence echoed across the nation with the weight of decades of political frustration, heartbreak, and unrealized justice. It wasn't merely a rebuttal, it was a mirror held up to the face of power, arrogance, and denial. And what made it even more powerful was the silence that followed, because for once Donald Trump had no comeback, no insult, no crowd to lean on, just the deafening silence of accountability. Live on national television, Jasmine Crockett didn't just confront a man, she confronted a myth, the self-created persona of invincibility Trump had long cultivated, from campaign rallies filled with chants of "build the wall" and "lock her up," to late-night tweet storms dripping with sarcasm, venom, and misinformation. He'd built an empire not of brick and mortar but of noise and division, and Crockett, with poise, precision, and undeniable truth, dismantled it piece by piece with facts and fearless rhetoric. She didn't yell, she didn't flinch, she simply stood her ground and let the truth do the heavy lifting. The cameras caught everything: his reddening face, the nervous shifting in his seat, the tightening grip on his papers, the half-open mouth searching for a comeback that never came. And that's what made it historic. It wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning, a moment when the bluster met its boundary and found it immovable. And while social media exploded and commentators from every network began their post-show dissections, Jasmine Crockett walked off that stage not as someone who had just humiliated a former president, but as someone who had reminded millions that character, courage, and clarity still hold weight in a world clouded by spin and spectacle. As the clip replayed across platforms, people watched not just the words but the energy behind them, a woman of color standing in her full power, refusing to be silenced by status or legacy, standing not just for herself but for every person who had been ridiculed, dismissed, or dehumanized by a system designed to elevate the loudest rather than the wisest. And in that moment, America remembered something that had been buried beneath years of division, scandals, and political noise. It remembered that truth spoken with conviction can pierce through the toughest lies, that courage doesn't always roar, sometimes it simply refuses to sit down, and that real leadership isn't built on intimidation but on integrity. The fallout from that moment wasn't just about Trump's bruised ego or the headlines the next morning. It was about a shift in public consciousness. People began to ask harder questions, not just about him but about every figure who had coasted on charisma while abandoning principle. And Crockett's performance, if you can even call it that, wasn't about showmanship, it was about stewardship. It was about taking the microphone not to amplify herself but to amplify what so many had been whispering under their breath for years. And perhaps most telling of all was Trump's response, not on the stage where he fumbled but later in a rage-filled post calling the event a setup, and her a radical leftist puppet. A now familiar pattern of deflection, projection, and denial, but the world had already seen the truth, and no all caps tweet could undo what had been witnessed millions of times over. And while Trump may have been the headline that night, it was Jasmine Crockett who became the story, a story of unshakable resolve, of speaking powerfully and plainly in the face of arrogance, and of proving once again that dignity doesn't shout, it stands. And so that single keynote, that one sentence, "Mr. Trump, I don't need to attack you to make a name for myself," wasn't just a political statement, it was a declaration. It was a line drawn in the sand between past and future, between spectacle and substance, between myth and accountability. And for those watching, especially the younger generation, it wasn't just a television moment, it was a masterclass in standing up, not just against a person but against everything that person represents when unchecked. And for Trump, who had long thrived in chaos and noise, the clarity of Jasmine's words was perhaps the loudest silence he had ever heard.